every loved Marvel villain, there is one that is hated by everyone, starting with Malekith the Accursed from Thor The Dark World. Here's a villain so bland that most fans genuinely forget he exists until someone brings up the worst MCU villains. Christopher Eccleston, a genuinely brilliant actor who brought gravitas to Doctor Who and depth to countless indie films, got buried under pounds of prosthetic makeup and handed a script that made him essentially a walking plot device. Malekith was supposed to be this ancient dark elf seeking revenge against Asgard, wielding the Reality Stone to plunge the universe into eternal darkness. On paper, that sounds absolutely epic. In execution, he stood around looking vaguely menacing while delivering dialogue that felt like it was written by someone who'd never watched a Marvel movie before. The character had zero personality, no memorable quotes, and motivations so generic they could have been lifted from any random fantasy villain playbook. Eccleston himself later admitted he was deeply disappointed with how the role turned out, feeling like he was playing a special effect rather than an actual character with thoughts and feelings. Even during the climactic battle, Thor seemed more engaged fighting the laws of physics than his supposed nemesis. The final confrontation felt obligatory. Like everyone involved knew they had to have a big action sequence, but nobody could figure out why anyone should care about the outcome. Fans walked out of theaters struggling to remember what Malekith actually wanted, or why anyone should feel relieved that he failed to get it. It was the kind of villain that made audiences appreciate just how much personality and charisma matter in creating memorable antagonists. But while Malekith became the poster child for forgettable Marvel villains, Tom Hiddleston's Loki proved that charisma and complexity could turn a secondary antagonist into the beating heart of the entire franchise. From his very first appearance in Thor, Loki wasn't just another power-hungry villain seeking to overthrow his older brother. He was a broken younger sibling whose entire identity had been built on a lie. Discovering he was actually the biological son of his father's greatest enemy, Hiddleston brought layers of pain, mischief, and vulnerability that made audiences simultaneously want to hug Loki and watch him burn everything down in spectacular fashion. What made Loki so beloved wasn't just his silver tongue or his flair for dramatic entrances, though fans certainly ate up every theatrical gesture and perfectly timed quip. It was the way he embodied every younger sibling who felt overshadowed. Every person who'd been told they weren't good enough. Every individual who'd made terrible choices while desperately trying to prove their worth to people who might never understand them. His journey from Thor's jealous brother to the god of mischief, who ultimately sacrificed himself to save his family, became one of the most emotionally satisfying character arcs in the entire MCU. Even when he was clearly the villain, manipulating events from behind the scenes and causing genuine harm to innocent people, audiences found themselves rooting for him to find some kind of redemption. When he finally did, saving Thor in the Dark World, and later dying heroically trying to stop Thanos in Infinity War, fans mourned him like he was a real person they'd lost. That's the power of a truly great villain who becomes something more than just an obstacle for the hero to overcome. Now let's discuss Justin Hammer from Iron Man 2, a villain who wasn't exactly hated for being threatening or dangerous, but rather for being the most annoying, try-hard person in any room he entered. Sam Rockwell played Hammer as a wannabe, Tony Stark, a defense contractor desperately trying to prove he was just as smart, just as cool, and just as successful as his infinitely more talented rival. The problem was that Hammer was absolutely none of those things, and watching him try so pathetically hard to be impressive while constantly failing at every attempt became genuinely uncomfortable for audiences to witness. His presentation at the Stark Expo, where he awkwardly danced onto the stage while trying to match Tony's natural charisma and effortless confidence, was pure secondhand embarrassment that made viewers want to hide behind their hands. Fans didn't hate Hammer because he was evil or scary or posed any real threat to the heroes. They hated him because he reminded them of every insecure, try-hard person they'd ever encountered who simply couldn't accept that they weren't as talented or impressive as they desperately wanted to be. Rockwell actually played the character perfectly, capturing every cringy-worthy detail of Hammer's desperate need for validation and respect. But perfectly portraying an irritating personality still results in a character that audiences find irritating to watch. Hammer's schemes were petty and poorly thought out. His technology was clearly inferior to Stark's innovations, and his desperate need for public recognition made him feel more like a nuisance than a genuine threat worthy of Iron Man's attention. Even his alliance with Whiplash felt less like a partnership between equals and more like a rich, insecure kid paying someone else to do the actual dangerous work while he tried to take credit for the results. Fans found themselves wishing Tony would just ignore Hammer entirely, rather than dignifying his pathetic attempts at rivalry with any response whatsoever, which is probably the most damning criticism possible for a character who's supposed to be a compelling antagonist. But if Justin Hammer represented everything annoying about insecure men with too much money and too little actual talent, Michael B. Jordan's Eric Killmonger showed how a villain's righteous anger and legitimate grievances could make him infinitely more compelling than the hero he was fighting against. Killmonger wasn't just another bad guy seeking power for its own sake, or trying to prove his superiority through conquest and domination. He was the abandoned son of Wakanda, Raised in Oakland while watching his people live in poverty and face systemic oppression just miles away from the most technologically advanced civilization on Earth, Jordan played him with the smoldering intensity of a man who'd been carrying generational trauma and righteous fury his entire life. Someone who'd served in the military and seen firsthand how America treated black communities, while knowing that his true homeland had the resources to change everything but actively chose to hide behind its barriers instead of helping. What made Killmonger so powerful and memorable wasn't just his physical prowess in combat or his tactical intelligence, though both were genuinely impressive throughout the film. It was the way he forced both T'Challa and the audience to confront Wakanda's fundamental moral failures and the selfishness of their isolationist policies. His argument wasn't wrong in any meaningful way. Wakanda really had stood by for centuries, while people who looked exactly like them suffered around the world, choosing comfortable isolation over moral intervention, even when they had the power and technology to make a real difference in fighting oppression. His methods were undeniably extreme and would have led to global chaos, but his underlying criticism of Wakandan passivity was completely valid, and Jordan played every single scene with the absolute conviction of someone who genuinely believed he was fighting for justice rather than personal gain. Even his final line about choosing death over bondage resonated powerfully with audiences who understood the deep historical weight of that choice and what it meant coming from a character whose entire motivation was rooted in the African diaspora's experience of oppression. Let's talk about another villain that genuinely disappointed comic book fans: the MCU's completely reimagined version of Taskmaster from Black Widow. In the comics, Taskmaster is this incredibly cool mercenary with photographic reflexes who can perfectly copy any fighting style just by watching it once, making him one of the most dangerous and unpredictable opponents any hero can face. He's got this iconic skull mask, he's witty and professional, he's genuinely dangerous without being evil, and he's been a fan-favorite character for decades across multiple comic series. So when Marvel announced that Taskmaster would be the main villain in Black Widow, comic book fans were genuinely excited to see how this beloved character would translate to the big screen and how his unique abilities would create interesting action sequences. What they got instead was a completely different character wearing Taskmaster's costume and using his powers, but sharing absolutely none of his personality or appeal. The MCU version turned out to be Antonia Dreykov, the daughter of the Red Room's leader, who'd been brainwashed and surgically modified into a mindless weapon after Natasha accidentally nearly killed her during a mission years earlier. Instead of the quip-heavy, personality-driven mercenary from the comics who treated superhero conflicts like professional challenges, fans got a silent, emotionless drone who existed mainly to create guilt and trauma for Black Widow rather than being an interesting character in her own right. The photographic reflexes were faithfully adapted and created some visually impressive fight scenes, but everything else that made Taskmaster special and memorable was completely stripped away in favor of making the character serve the movie's themes about Natasha's past mistakes. Comic fans felt like Marvel had taken one of their favorite characters and used only the visual design while completely abandoning everything that made him cool, interesting, and worth adapting in the first place. It wasn't just that the character was different from the source material, it was that the changes felt like a fundamental betrayal of what made Taskmaster appealing to begin with. But if Taskmaster showed how beloved comic characters could be completely mishandled in adaptation, Josh Brolin's Thanos demonstrated how a villain with clear, understandable goals could become one of the most compelling characters in cinema history. Thanos wasn't just another cosmic threat seeking universal domination for the sake of power or ego. He genuinely believed he was saving the universe from inevitable collapse due to overpopulation and resource depletion, having watched his own home planet of Titan destroy itself through exactly those problems. What made him terrifying wasn't just his immense power, though snapping half of all life out of existence was certainly an impressive demonstration of cosmic-level abilities. It was his complete conviction that he was the hero of his own story, a reluctant savior forced to make the hard choices that nobody else had the courage to make. Brolin brought a weary gravitas to the character, playing Thanos as a tired philosopher king who'd seen countless civilizations destroy themselves through greed, short-sightedness, and inability to make difficult decisions for the greater good. Even as he committed genocide on an unimaginable scale, there was something tragically noble about his unwavering commitment to his cause and his willingness to sacrifice everything, including the people he loved, to achieve what he believed was necessary. The moment he sacrificed Gamora for the Soul Stone wasn't played as an evil triumph or a moment of sadistic pleasure, but as genuine anguish from a father who loved his daughter deeply but loved his mission even more. Fans found themselves understanding his logic even while being absolutely horrified by his methods, which is the mark of a truly complex antagonist. When he finally achieved his goal and retired to watch the sunrise on a peaceful planet, audiences felt the complex satisfaction of watching a character complete an impossible task at tremendous personal cost. Let's talk about Mickey Rourke's Ivan Vanko, better known as Whiplash from Iron Man 2. Here was a villain who should have been absolutely terrifying on multiple levels. A brilliant physicist whose father was betrayed by Howard Stark decades earlier, seeking revenge against Tony for the sins of the previous generation while wielding technology that could genuinely match Iron Man's capabilities. And that initial highway attack scene was genuinely spectacular, showing a villain who could literally cut through Tony's armor and leave him helpless in the middle of traffic. But somewhere between the promising setup and the final battle, Whiplash devolved into a one-note character obsessed with making Tony Stark bleed without any clear plan beyond general destruction. The problem wasn't Rourke's performance, which had moments of genuine menace and unpredictability that reminded audiences why he'd been such a compelling actor in films like The Wrestler. It was that the script never gave Vanko any depth beyond angry Russian with daddy issues and cool energy whips. His dialogue consisted mostly of cryptic threats delivered in a thick accent, and his master plan boiled down to building a bunch of robot suits and hoping Tony would show up to fight them in a generic action sequence. But if Whiplash showed how a promising villain could be completely wasted, Ian McKellen and Michael Fassbender's Magneto showed how a villain's personal history and genuine philosophical convictions could make him one of the most sympathetic and complex characters in any superhero story. Eric Landshair isn't just a mutant supremacist seeking to dominate humanity through superior genetic gifts. He's a Holocaust survivor who watched his mother die in a concentration camp, who witnessed his people be systematically exterminated while the world stood by and did nothing, and who emerged from that experience with hard-learned lessons about how quickly civilized society can turn genocidal when faced with people it considers different or threatening. When he sees mutants facing similar persecution and hatred from ordinary humans who fear what they don't understand. His extreme response comes from a place of genuine trauma and bitter wisdom about human nature at its worst. What makes Magneto so beloved among fans isn't his incredible magnetic powers or his iconic helmet and cape, though those elements certainly contribute to his memorable presence. It's the way both McKellen and Fassbender have portrayed him as a man whose extremism comes directly from having lived through humanity's darkest chapter and refusing to let it happen again to another group of persecuted minorities. His friendship and philosophical disagreements with Charles Xavier represent one of the most compelling ideological conflicts in all of comics. Two men who want the same basic outcome, but have drawn completely different conclusions about how to achieve it. Charles believes in peaceful coexistence and gradual acceptance through demonstration of mutant virtue and patience, while Eric knows from bitter personal experience that oppressed minorities can't rely on their oppressors' better angels, or wait for prejudice to slowly fade away. Even when he's clearly the antagonist, threatening innocent people and using methods that Xavier finds morally reprehensible, audiences understand exactly why he's made the choices he has and why he believes peaceful solutions are naive fantasies. His methods may be extreme and his conclusions may be wrong, but his fears are entirely rational given what he's witnessed firsthand. Moving on to another villain that fans love to hate, we have Darren Cross, also known as Yellowjacket from the first Ant-Man movie. Here was Marvel's attempt at creating a corporate villain, a successful businessman whose greed and ambition drove him to steal Hank Pym's revolutionary shrinking technology and sell it to the highest bidder regardless of the consequences, selling dangerous technology to bad people for unclear reasons. His motivations were paper-thin, his personality was practically non-existent, and his relationship with Hank Pym was severely underdeveloped despite being supposedly central to the entire plot. The script wanted audiences to believe that Cross had once been like a son to Hank, but never showed enough of that relationship to make his betrayal feel meaningful or personal. Even his descent into madness from prolonged exposure to Pym particles felt like an afterthought rather than a compelling character arc. His climactic battle with Scott Lang felt entirely perfunctory, just two shrinking men in high-tech suits punching each other while the real emotional stakes of the movie played out between Scott and his daughter Cassie. Fans complained that Yellowjacket was exactly the kind of one-dimensional antagonist that Marvel had supposedly moved beyond in their more recent films. A throwback to the days when villains existed, purely to give heroes something to fight in the third act. He wasn't scary, he wasn't sympathetic, he wasn't even particularly memorable beyond his admittedly cool suit design. He was just there to provide conflict, which is perhaps the most damning criticism you can level at any villain in a medium where compelling antagonists can elevate entire franchises. But while Yellowjacket represented everything wrong with paint-by-numbers villainy, Willem Dafoe's triumphant return as Green Goblin in Spider-Man No Way Home reminded everyone why some villain performances become absolutely legendary and stand the test of time. Dafoe had originated the role 20 years earlier in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, and his cackling, unhinged Norman Osborn had already secured his place in superhero movie history as one of the most memorable and quotable villains ever captured on film. But his appearance in No Way Home took that already iconic performance to an entirely different level of intensity and psychological complexity, and Dafoe played him with the accumulated intensity of a man who'd spent 2 decades planning his revenge against the Wallcrawler. The scene where he systematically turns May Parker's apartment into a psychological battlefield, alternating seamlessly between Norman's confused vulnerability and the Goblin's pure, calculating malevolence, was some of the finest acting ever captured in a superhero film. Dafoe didn't just reprise his role or phone in a nostalgic cameo. He elevated the character and showed how a truly great villain performance can actually improve with age and experience. His final confrontation with Tom Holland's Spider-Man carried the full emotional weight of 20 years of superhero cinema, and when he finally succeeded in goading Peter into nearly beating him to death with his bare hands, audiences felt the full impact of what it really means when a hero faces a villain who truly understands how to break them psychologically. That's the crucial difference between a good villain and a truly great one. The Goblin didn't just want to defeat Spider-Man physically or even kill him outright, he wanted to corrupt him and turn him into something darker. And Dafoe made every single moment of that psychological warfare feel absolutely terrifying and believable.